Hello, everybody. I'm really glad you could join us today for our Equity and Excellence, the identification serving of American Indian youth with gift and talents, presented by Ann Gray. Ann has her PhD at Purdue University in the College of Education, Gifted Education Resource Institute, GERI. Prior to graduate school, she taught for 6 years at a Bureau of Education grant school in northeastern Arizona, and currently she's a research assistant on a grant addressing equity of student gifted identification. Anne, would you like to introduce your panel?
Hi, Yate, Bilagana Nishle, Bilagana Bashishchin, Bilagana Dashiche, Bilagana Dashinale, Ann Gray Yanishya. My name is Ann Gray. I am white. That's what that introduction means. My family's a little muddy on the European side, and with some English, German, French, and Welsh. Our panel today, the title is, what does equity is excellence mean in the identification and serving of American Indian youth with gifts and talents? And I wanted to just quickly acknowledge that equity is excellence is a little bit, I mean, I totally respect and get the intent behind that, but it is sort of a problematic theme. And I want to make sure that we're sort of troubling that being problematic for American Indian students and other minoritized groups. And Kelly already told you that we will take your questions at the end, so just go ahead and put them in the chat box. And I wanted to quickly introduce my panelists who will be answering. I'll just do a fast introduction, and then I'd like them to add anything they want to that introduction.
Can I interrupt for just 1 minute? It looks like as people are clicking on the link to be able to get in, sometimes they're inserting a little bit of a space. So I don't know how to help people who aren't in already, but just so you know, as you guys are logging into things, be really careful to just click the whole thing and not insert a space, because that will break the link and you won't be able to get there.
Got it.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
No, all right. First I'll introduce Dr. Marcia Gentry, who is one of my mentors and was the head of my committee at Purdue. She is the director of the Gifted Education Research and Resource Institute at Purdue University. Marcia?
I have to find the unmute button. Hello, what do you want me to say, Anne?
Do you want to add to that introduction or anything?
No, it was a pleasure to have Anne as a student, and I miss her dreadfully. Sorry she's gone. Yeah, I've been a teacher. I don't necessarily view myself as an expert in this particular area as much as I view myself as a student and an advocate, and hopefully can share some of what we've learned and continue to make strides. So I'm not coming from a perspective of I know more than anybody in the room, but rather what have we learned about equity? What have we learned about access? What have we learned about missingness? And how can we take steps to ensure that the talents of all students are met and developed? So that's kind of where my perspective is coming from. That's all.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Masta, who is in curriculum and instruction at Purdue University.
Also the unmute. Yeah, kind of similarly, so I look at, so I'm a member of the St. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and I look at really how the curriculum does not talk about Native students and what that means for their own experience, but also like what that means for non-Native people to also not learn about Native issues in schools and how that leads to, right, a lot of misinformation about things that are kind of happening contemporarily. So.
Thank you. And Serena Gray, who's got a BA in Ethnic Studies from Brown University.
Ja, ben ik edo shidene. Adon en ishlinigi e bilagan and ishle, touching ni bushes chain, bilagana dashiche honoratni dashanale. The Arizona Shima A and the Ernest well, yeah. Shay ya Serena Gray in it, yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Serena. So in case you didn't catch it and all of that Navajo stuff, Anne is actually my mom. So that's fun. And so I'm here to just kind of offer, you know, being a Native gifted student in a lot of different, having a lot of different schooling experiences throughout New Mexico and like partly in Arizona. So I'm kind of here to give that perspective and just be here to listen and learn and share what I can. So cool.
Thank you. So just starting with our questions. So the first question is, what are the inequities experienced by American Indian youth with gifts and talents? Marcia, do you want to start with what you know about that?
Sure. First, I'll direct you to our website at Purdue. I'm not going to share my screen or, you know, do a PowerPoint, but if you go to purdue.edu/Jerry, and I'll put this in the comments, you can click on a link of our new report called Access Denied. And was integral in this. This was part of her dissertation work. And what we did was we looked at every single school and every single child in the country over 4 waves of population data. So from the Office of Civil Rights. And typically before 2011-12, those data were only available every 10 years because they would take a sample and then everybody would say, well, we're not including the Native American or American Indian students or indigenous peoples because they're too small and we can't figure it out. So we just eliminate them and we talk about Latino, we talk about Black, we talk about Asian and white. And since there is now population data, we made an effort to take a good long look at inclusion in gifted education, identification as gifted. And we started with access. And in order to be identified and served, you first have to attend a school that identifies. So we divided the schools in the states in half, basically into 2 pots, those that identify and those that don't. And for those that identify, we looked at equity. But it was interesting, across the entire country, what we found was in general, it didn't matter what race you were, you had equal access to be identified. Now that doesn't mean you would be identified equitably, but you at least had the opportunity, unless you were Native. And Native youth were the only youth across the entire country who were less likely to attend a school that identifies. They were only 92% as likely as others, but in places like Alaska, where they have the largest population of indigenous youth, or even New Mexico and Arizona, sometimes the access was poor as well. So access is the first step to being identified and served. The next thing that would happen, if you look nationally, it looked like, well, you know, the representation is 83% of one, you know, 83% likely. But if we looked at it state by state, it was horrific. And so not only was there less access for Native youth, there was an inequitable representation and a huge number, actually more Native youth missing from identification than identified. And I'm not even going to get into the programming, you know, at this point. It's just, are we even looking for talent? And I think for populations that have been marginalized and made invisible and not talked about and excluded from the research. The exclusion goes on from, you know, into programs and talent development programs. We're more likely to view Native youth from a deficit perspective than we are from a strength perspective. So, for example, in New Mexico, if you're from New Mexico and tuning in, you can go to that link that when I stop talking, I'll type into the comments, and you can download the New Mexico report card, and you can look at the representation indices across the state, and it's pretty scary. It's not good in Arizona. It's not good in Alaska. And what troubles me most about that is that it seems that the larger the concentration of Native people, the less well represented they are. And the only exception to that nationally is in Oklahoma. And we plan to take a look and maybe figure out what are they doing differently and why are they the exception to this seeming rule of the bigger the percentage of Native youth, the less likely we are to A, identify, and B, to serve. So, you know, and I don't think that this is surprising when we have a president honor the code talkers with a picture of Andrew Jackson in the background, purposefully done. When we have, you know, a celebration of Columbus Day, or we're excited about, you know, Thanksgiving, and we don't even give it a second thought. I think there is so much racism that people don't even realize is racist toward a population that is so small that they've lost the ability to advocate in effective ways because there's not a critical mass. So that to me is all the more reason to begin to take a look at how do we recognize, identify, nurture, and develop talents in populations that have been subject to genocide and marginalization for centuries. So.
Thank you. Stephanie, same question? Do you want me to
Yeah.
repeat?
So repeat it just to make sure I don't ramble, but Marcia brought up a lot of really good points that I'm going to build on. So,
what are the inequities experienced by American youth, Indian youth with gifts and talents?
So I think that, to kind of build on Marcia's points, like part of how we got here is that, the curriculum, like our understanding of social studies history and social studies curriculum is super limited. And in fact, like if you look at the way we teach US history, we stopped talking about Native Americans kind of roughly like right after Andrew Jackson, right around Reconstruction. And so they're never heard from again. And so what this means is that you have really like generations of people who've kind of grown up believing that Native Americans are no longer present. In fact, when I was prior to coming to Purdue, I was at Iowa State, and I taught our pre-service teachers their course in diversity, and one of our units was on historical and contemporary Native American education. And one of the students said to me at the end of the unit, like, "Oh, this is super fascinating because like I always thought that Native Americans were extinct." And this was in 2013. I mean, like, and I also had to laugh because I introduced myself at the start of class, and clearly I was not extinct, And so I think what that means though is that every time then we talk about, and so students never learn about the richness of Native culture, right? They don't learn about the fact that Native communities were thriving before the arrival of the settlers. Like they don't know that a lot of the government structures of the United States that the settlers used were based on tribal ideas, Native communities. And so that means that every time they're confronted with a Native person, it creates this dissonance. And so, and what happens to students in schools is that they're, I call them the modern day ghosts, right? They're absent. They're absent from the conversation. They're, as Marcia pointed out, they're absent from the data. And if you are an absent person, then that means teachers are not paying attention to you in the way that they should. At the same time, teachers are confronted with a lot of negative narratives around Native youth. And so they often choose to believe those as opposed to, taking the opportunity to really to kind of identify like where their biases and misconceptions are coming from, right? I think teachers sometimes don't recognize like how they are socialized in the system. And so, you know, they believe like, oh yeah, I'm doing, you know, I care about students, I want students to be successful, but they don't understand that our ideas of what success means are really built into what we have learned throughout our own schooling, throughout our own education. Because it's not like our awareness of Native children, Native experiences gets better like in college, because it doesn't always, you know. And so I think that, you know, so yes, I'll end there.
Thank you. Serena, what would you like to add?
All right. So the other two panelists brought up a lot of really good stuff, but I think like one of the biggest things that kind of came to my mind when this question was offered as one of the things that we're going to discuss is just like, and this is not just for like in like gifted education settings, like, you know, special out of classroom G&T times, but even like in everyday classroom is just like the irrelevance of like programming and services for Native youth is like a huge thing. I remember like, so I mean, I'm from like New Mexico and Arizona, where there's like heaps and heaps of like Native and brown, just like brown youth, like all over the place. But we are still like being presented with like information about like just like really like very colonial and like white topics that we didn't really understand. Like when I was in elementary school, we got a new G&T teacher, and she like ended up trying to like format our like G&T time around like Socrates or something like that. And we're just like these like res kids from New Mexico, and we have no idea what that means. Like there was no connection for us. There was no like way for us to really be able to like come into that space and like bring ourselves into that space and like be relevant and worthy of like saying anything. So I think that like that's kind of a really big thing, is that there just aren't adjustments being made for Native youth to be able to like feel comfortable and valid in a lot of like educational spaces. And I think that that also kind of goes back to like what Stephanie was saying about like either they like, a lot of people think that like natives don't exist, or they have really weird like preconceived notions about who Native youth are and what they want from their life and like where they're headed in their future. So there isn't a lot of, so everything is kind of based off of those biases. So, and I think that that really plays into like the identification of Native youth as gifted or talented, but also as like, you know, youth who have like dreams and aspirations, who want to do things with their futures. So I think that that's a really big thing, and like just not expecting or holding Native youth to the same, not like standards isn't the right word, but like ideas of the future. Because, and this is a discussion that like I've had with like the other panelists and my mom before, is like students are like expected to take their schoolwork like it's their job and the most important. That's not true for a lot of students, and it's definitely not true for a lot of Native students. So I don't know, there's a lot of things. I think a lot of it is like, you know, having those like weird preconceived notions that like don't allow the growth and like space for Native youth to be themselves in a lot of spaces.
And in gifted classrooms, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Stephanie, I'll start with you for this next question, which is, will equity in gifted education look the same for American Indian students as it does for other racialized students or just other students?
I mean, I would probably say no, right? And it shouldn't. You know, and I think that, I mean, in some ways we, you know, we kind of have to like expand out a little bit about like, so what does it mean to be gifted? Like, what does this look like in school practices? Are schools even really designed? I mean, even with gifted programs, like, are schools really designed to bring out the type of like giftedness that we see in people? You know, I would argue that school-based giftedness looks a little bit different than like other types of giftedness. But no, and I think that the reason why is that, you know, like native folks are both racialized and colonized in the United States, and that's what makes them different than other racialized groups, is that they also have this this nation relationship with the United States, not just a racial relationship with the United States. And so that adds a different, I think, political component to, you know, when we think about education and who controls Native education, who wants to control Native education. Also, I think that, you know, I mean, I'm painting with some broad strokes here, but how, you know, how families conceive of education looks different for racialized minorities. You know, I think that, you know, for my family, I mean, my great grandparents were in boarding schools. And so that's not a far removed generational component. And so my great grandparents and my grandparents and my parents like do not trust, right, traditional forms of education. And so they don't necessarily see it as an opportunity, right? They see it as a tool of assimilation. And so I think if you're creating gifted programs that are to serve Native students, right, you have to think about all of those particular contexts. You know, what does family involvement look like? Family involvement is going to look a little bit different. You know, what does it mean to, like, how do we bring in Indigenous worldviews and perspectives? You know, I like to remind folks that we were solving problems long before Western science told us how to solve problems. And, you know, allowing for that kind of space to happen in these programs, I think is critical.
Thank you. Marcia, would you like me to repeat the question? Will equity in gifted education look the same for American Indian students as it does for other students and racialized students?
Okay, so that's a great question. And it speaks, I think, to the variety of qualities of programs that we have across the country, or lack of quality programs. If a gifted education program is identify the 30 students who you think are the most book smart and take them down the hall in 3rd grade and do a rainforest unit with them, you know, that's not really appropriate for any student. You know, whatever the teacher's interested in, will do that. Socrates, rainforest, you know, maybe advanced math is a little bit different. But if we're doing in gifted education what we ought to be doing, which is providing students with the opportunity and encouragement and resources to solve problems of the human race and of our society. I mean, I think it could look similar if it were done well. But from the perspectives of the students who are involved in the problem solving, the students who were protesting on the Dakota pipeline were some of the students who came to our Jerry Summer Youth programs. That's a real world action that matters. And when I think of a gifted program, I think of a program where students ask questions to which they don't know the answers to. They identify and solve problems that make a difference and that matter. And I think specifically making sure that our gifted programs are diverse and that have diverse perspectives. Stephanie, you mentioned, you know, solving problems long before the Western, I mean, Canada just legitimized all of the healers and all of the background of what is known about science from the oral tradition of Indigenous peoples. That sort of thing is what ought to be in a gifted program. And it isn't just Native students then who benefit, it's all students. So I think that that question goes to what is it we're actually doing, and is what we're doing justified? I'm a big believer of putting ice skates on a kid to see if they can skate rather than measuring their foot to see if the skate will fit their foot. So opportunity for all kids, sort of a gifted education approach in K-12, so that we use our programming to identify kids who need more. And that isn't by using measures to say, well, you are and you aren't, quote, gifted. You know, when I read an article that says the gifted, I'm like, the gifted what? Gifted in what and how? So gifted is not a noun. A student with gifts and talents in what area, brought to bear how, and how do we as educators shepherd and develop that? And I think that's one of the biggest problems. And the other issue is that 80% of all teachers are white. They didn't go into education to hurt children. White teachers are not inherently bad, but diverse teachers help, and they help all kids. And white teachers need to be anti-racist, and they need to take it upon themselves to understand cultures that are not their own. And there is no such thing as, quote, native culture. You know, we have 560 some tribal units, peoples in this country alone. I no longer use the word America, I use United States, because America is not what we are. And so I think when we think about all these different groups, when we lump them all together, and we did that in our National Excellence Report because that's how the data were gathered. However, we have to recognize, and this is another problem with education, there are many different cultures and perspectives within this very small group of people who managed to survive horrible atrocities. So a student from Alaska in an Inuit tribe is going to be different than a Flathead student, than a Navajo student, or a Dene, or than an Ojibwe student. And we need to respect that. And I think at first look individual, then cultural group, and where is that situated? A student in a urban setting, or like Justina at high school here in Lafayette, you know, she goes to school and asks, and she and I are co-writing a chapter, so this is public, I'm not betraying any confidence, but she went to school and asked if she could start her presentation in another language. And this was a course on diversity or whatever, it was a cultural course. And the teacher looked at her and said, sure, you can start in Spanish. I'm like, you know, these assumptions, yeah, right? Close your mouth, Stephanie. I was like, you can start in Spanish. And she wrote that to me because they asked me to write a chapter for teachers on how to address it. And I'm like, well, I'm not qualified to write that chapter. And I wanted to collect a bunch of data, but I couldn't get it through IRB. And besides, Justina, she's been to 3 different kinds of schools and she can speak to it beautifully. So yeah, I think it could look the same if we were all doing the different things that matter. Does that make sense? Gifted ed isn't like pulling out smart kids and doing a unit with them. It's helping them become productive members of society for the betterment of humankind. And I think sometimes in school we forget that. We're worried about how well they bubble, and that doesn't much matter. I'm done. Okay, sorry.
Well, and also to bring it back to New Mexico, that you know, not only do we have in New Mexico students from 19 different pueblos, the Navajo Nation, the Apache Nation, but we've also got students coming in from northern tribes, eastern tribes, western tribes, farther south tribes. I mean, don't forget that some of our students who get lumped in as being Latino or Chicano are also from indigenous populations in Central America or even South America. So yeah, just to your point of that we're doing this pan-Indian idea, that is not the reality at all. Serena, did you want to address this?
Yeah. So yeah, I was definitely going to bring up what Marcia brought up about how, especially with like the lack of resources for teachers and educators about Native youth. It's really hard. It can get really difficult when you're trying to like be specific to like cater your student population. So like if you know that you have Navajo students and you know that you have Pueblo students, it can still be really difficult to find those resources. So like, just like side note, like keep doing that work because it's really, really, really important for your students, and like to like be specific and like if you're going to use a resource from like a Native, like if you're going to read a book from a Native author, or like watching a film directed by like an Indigenous like director or something like that, like finding out as much information about that as possible, because like it's so important. Like I cannot even tell you how like much time I've spent like just like wanting to know who is giving me this information, and like struggling to find like a tribal community that like someone belongs to, or like and things like that. So I mean, like that work is really, really important. And so like, and this is kind of the struggle of like being someone who works with Native youth, and like the struggle of working like
again.
Native, and then like, you know, individual communities. But Marsha already talked about that, so I'll leave that going. But I think that what like Stephanie said to like start off when she answered was that like, no, it might not necessarily look the same, but that's not a bad thing. Like that's fine. I think a lot of it kind of also comes down to like understanding that that giftedness for Indigenous communities might not be what you imagine, might not be like what you're taught to like look for and to identify. And so respecting when like there is a student who like you know, okay, what am I trying to say? So like Marsha's like the master of like gifted identification stuff, at least the master that I know. And like, right, and like really expanding your ideas of like how you identify and look for gifted and talented students. And I think recognizing that like arsenal of tools that you have should include and understand and respect Indigenous ways of identifying gifted students, because like they might not be doing so good in their regular classroom, but they go home and they go to ceremony and they know all the songs, and like they're training with like the medicine mans and like that kind of stuff, and like that is a form of giftedness and like beauty and awesomeness. So like respecting that and like doing your best of like cultivating that in whatever way that you can, and supporting that student to achieve their goals. And I think that kind of also comes back to my other point, is that like the goal for nurturing like a gift or talent might not just be to like get them into a good college and get a good job. Like it might be that they want to stay home and like serve their community, or like stay home and like take care of their grandparents because like that's how they know how to do. And like, so I think recognizing that it's not just that like equity is going to look different, but just the dreams and aspirations of your Native youth might be a little bit different from what you expect or what you're taught should be the goal of education. And also like, just because it doesn't look the same isn't a bad thing. And like taking all of this and applying it to all your other students is like A+ work, because you know, all that good stuff. Nobody's the same. We want it all the good stuff. It kind of started rambling at the end there, but really just like respecting Indigenous ways of like understanding giftedness is like super duper important. Yeah, there's a lot of other stuff that we could say, but then I'll just like keep talking forever. So I'll shut up now.
Thank you. And we'll get to our last question is how do we create a safe space for the honoring and nurturing of the gifts and talents of American Indian students in our classrooms, districts, and state? And just to kind of go back to, so Sheila Gallagher was our keynote this morning, and in their work in North Carolina, she found that one of the things that kept coming up from people participating in the group work they were doing was people asking the question, you know, so where they're working so hard to provide equitable gifted education identification and services, but when you ask the people of color in North Carolina about placing their children in gifted education, the comments that she kept hearing was, why would I do that to my child? And that is something that I'm very grateful for, that Stephanie has brought up. And okay, so she only said it once, but it replays in my mind over and over and over again. Why would I do that to my child? And so, well, so I guess I'll go ahead and, since I just mentioned her name, I'll go ahead and start with Stephanie on that. Do you want me to repeat the original question too? Okay, so the original question is, how do we create a safe space for the honoring and nurturing of the gifts and talents of American Indian students in our classrooms, districts, and in our state?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it kind of goes back to, you know, thinking through. I work with a lot of teachers in service, and I work with a lot of pre-service teachers. And, you know, I think that in general, they mean well, right? I mean, I have this phrase I use, like, you know, well-meaning white people, like they mean well. And, you know, but I used to joke with them, and I said, like, if love was all it took to solve the world's problems, like we wouldn't have world problems. And so, you know, just like, it's not being open to this idea that there are other ways to conceptualize gifts, and, you know, to make space for that is one part, right? But like interrogating our practices all the time is the next part, you know? And I think that there's, and then making sure that we're doing this in ways that like aren't superficial. And, you know, maybe it was for the slides, or maybe it was something I said to somebody else, but I said, you know, like when I get contacted by local school teachers to come in and talk about Native issues this time of year, I always tell people no, but I'm happy to come in February, or I'm happy to come in March, or I'm happy to come another time. Because like, I'm not going to participate in this like sense of like, we only talk about Native folks when it's Thanksgiving time, or Thanksgiving time, as I like to call it. And so, you know, so I think that there's, so it's not just like an openness, right? The openness is important, but people also have to be open and then recognize how they contribute. And I think that a lot of times schools are willing to do the first, like they're like, yeah, sure, we're open to new ideas, like please bring in like books or come talk to us. But they're not necessarily willing to do the second, which is like, okay, how do we do this institutionally? Like, how are we disciplining kids? How are we engaging with kids around lesson plans? How are we doing all of these things that tend to favor white students over non-white students, right? And so I think that would be my you know, my initial thing is it's like, it's not just the willingness, but it's a willingness to interrogate and to interrogate frequently. You know, when I worked with a local community when I was in Iowa, and they drew a fairly substantial Indigenous population for being in Iowa. And one of the things they had contacted me about was they wanted to, there were some achievement gap issues, right? So they were calling achievement gap, which is kind of a problem too, but there were some achievement gap issues. And, you know, when I went in, I said, well, you know, the first thing that we all need to agree is that, like, part of the reason why these achievement gaps exist here is because we bring to our teaching like bias, and bias informed by racism. And they were like, well, no, that's not why this is, right? The kids just need to learn better. I'm like, well, not really, actually. And so, yeah, so I think that there's, and, you know, I've often said, like, especially around like all of the racial unrest that's happening right now, that white folks, and since our teachers tend to be mostly white people, you know, they're very quick to want to move into action, right? I want to fix the problem, as opposed to like taking a step back and doing a real like serious investigation into what is causing the problem, and then thinking about how to fix it in that end, right? Because it's not just a matter of like, you know, we think about safe space, right? It's like, it's safety to be who you are, you know, and to not fear that kind of stuff. But like, that's going to require a lot of work, right? And a lot of trust building, right? It's not something like, we just don't get to say like, oh, this is a safe classroom now, and students are gonna be like, okay, I'm down, right? Like, that's not how this works. So
Thank you. Marcia, do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I got it.
Okay.
So I think it's a two-pronged, at least maybe three-pronged approach, bottom up, top down. When I look at the National Excellence Report, and we just got picked up on the conversation, and I've been writing little blips for each state, like 2 paragraphs about how their state, you know, but what we have is documented inequity in programs that take public money. And we have inequity of special education with over-identification, but only over-identification in areas that are subjective. I mean, you can take a measure to find out if you're hard of hearing, but if it's a behavior issue, you're more likely to be referred if you're Black or brown. So there's over-identification there, and there's under-identification in talent programs. And all of those schools take public money. And what we found, and I did an article on this in 2009 with Su Yun, and we went back to like 1972, since they've been collecting data on gifted programs through the Office of Civil Rights. And there has never been equity, and it is not getting better. And the excellence gap exists. The gap may be closing, but at the top end, it exists, it's widening, it's not getting better. And what this is this is institutionalized segregation, and it's institutionalized racism, period. And gifted ed is being used as a tool of, I don't want my kids to go to school with those kids, so I'll have a gifted program. And that's wrong. So what states can do is they can take our data and they can say, if you're going to have a gifted program, it needs to be equitable. And each state can do that. Right now I'm looking at language for California, for CAG, because I was just talking to them, and they don't even have language, but they have inequity issues for Latina, for Native kids, and for Black kids. So the top down is that we need to examine our data. You can go to the OCR site, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And you can look at your own data from your own school, and you can say, how bad are we? And do something about that. That's number one. But then what Stephanie was saying from the bottom up, how do we confront what it is we do and how we do it, and how do we nurture children, and how do we have expectations from them? One of the ways to deal with the identification inequity is to stop using the measures that give us bad results. We have an article under consideration right now where we looked at the top 10 measures that are used to identify whether a kid is or isn't gifted. Now, I want to talk about developing gifts and talents and gifted behaviors. I don't want to talk about giftedness as a state of being. I don't believe people major in IQ. I don't believe when somebody's 8 years old, we can decide if they're smart or not. So that said, we use these measures, either individual or group measures. And out of the 10 that we looked at, and these are the most common measures, there was only one that even had Indigenous people in its sample from which it was developed. And yet it's being applied to those people, you know, to make high stakes decisions. That's wrong. Even the other measures that included Black and brown kids who weren't Indigenous never did any invariance testing or testing to see if it worked on those groups. They just said, hey, we had a representative sample. Never mind that the scores that are yielded for Black and brown youth are a standard deviation lower than the scores that are yielded for white and Asian youth. And we use it to make high stakes decisions. So we're using measures that at the onset are disproportionate and disparate, and we're getting disproportionate results. No surprise there, because they were developed that way. And then we make high stakes decisions, and then we wring our hands and we say, oh, we don't have proportional representation. So we have to get beyond thinking that a test developed on white people for use on white people somehow captures giftedness across many cultures. There have to be multiple pathways in, and that's a top-down, you know, look at the data and fix it. Bottom up is, and this will, I'll end with this because I have two more things. I think it's really important that we tell teachers there is an underrepresentation of these children. We need you to be talent scouts. Tanya Moon and Catherine Brighton did that in Virginia, and they told me, well, we just prime the teachers. I'm like, prime them? What does that mean? We tell them that the kids are underserved, and we ask them to find them. And because they have good intentions and they're not there to do harm, they say, oh, okay, let us help you find them. So that's a really simple, easy way. We can also use local group norms. And then I'm going to go back to some of my first encounters in a meaningful way as a professor and educator on the Navajo Nation. I went to Ganado, and in the Ganado Intermediate School was a room. And the room had a refrigerator and a sofa and a big screen TV and internet and a stove and couches and a table. And that was the parent room. That was the room where the parents could come in and hang out and catch up on their email or internet and wait for a meeting with the principal or whatever. And it was a very inviting place for parents who might find school less than inviting, who might distrust the institution. So I think there are simple ways of making school buildings places where parents might actually want to come. It took us, we started in 2010 bringing youth from 5 or 6 different Native communities to produce summer programs. And in the beginning, we had to go, we had to have a feed, we had to have soup and cornbread and fry bread and hang out and tell the parents that we're parents and that we're not going to let anything happen to their kids and that we care. And, you know, and after a while it was like, well, you can come if you want, but you know, our people know you now and we trust you and we have lots of kids we want to send to you. So I think that human to human contact where we're doing the best we can and we're trying to understand that kids have needs. I remember going into the one of the dorms where the kids were staying, and the Navajo girls had built a hogan, and I showed them which way east was, and we had to change the direction of the door of the hogan, and we were all laughing, you know, because they were showing me how you had to walk in. I said, but isn't it supposed to face east? And they're like, you know that? And I'm like, I do. And so they're like, well, which way is east? I said, this way is east. So just listening and learning and interacting and valuing. Just because a kid isn't speaking up doesn't mean they're not learning. Just because they're not getting straight A's doesn't mean they're not gifted. And this idea that somehow all brown kids are nonverbal and there's some measure out there that will capture their intelligence. You know, we have a hope scale and it's a teacher nomination scale, but unlike people who have developed other instruments, we take no royalties from that scale. All those royalties go back to kids who can't afford to come to programs. There's no way that we should be developing instruments and trying to get rich on equity on the backs of kids who are underidentified. So I think it's solvable, but I think it has to come from the families, the teachers, and from the policy.
Thank you. Serena, would you like to speak to this?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question. I think what Stephanie said, like you can't just say it's a safe space and then expect your students to feel safe because you call it that. So this is like a question that I think everyone does, like just the idea of creating a safe space is something that everyone should spend a lot more time thinking about and investigating, like why is it necessary to create a safe space, and like why is it necessary to like say it's a safe space even if like you're not the one who's coming in there and not feeling safe. So I think it's really like a community building action to take, is like creating the safe space, is that you're not just like building it on your own, is that like the students who are coming into your classroom deserve a say in what makes them feel safe. But so like that's kind of that. But I kind of want to go to this part of the question that is to honor your students, because like it's like a very interesting word for me, like as a Native person, because like honoring people is like a very big part of like ceremony for us, for like my community and a lot of communities that I've been like very privileged to like be welcomed into, is like honoring is a really big thing. So I think like recognizing that like that it is like a privilege and an honor to have those students in your classroom and to have their experiences and their stories there in the classroom with you. But then also recognizing that like when they're coming into your classroom, when they're coming into your program, they are bringing themselves, all of their ancestors, their whole family, their community, they're carrying that on their back every step of the way. So like recognizing and honoring that you're not just like catering to a single student, but you're catering to a student who like has all of these other responsibilities and all of these dreams for carrying what they learned back to their community and like doing their best for their family. So like that's a thing. And so like recognizing the entirety of your student and not just like as this like person standing there coming to learn like this Western colonial like education nonsense. But so like there's that, but I think also like if you're trying to create a safe space where you want your students to be able to share who they are, it's very important to be willing to share parts of yourself. That's it should in your safe space, it's not about creating a hierarchy, it's about creating a leveled community. So I think like recognizing, especially for Native youth who are often expected to speak for like their entire communities, there or like and like the entirety of like Native America and like all Indigenous people across the world forever. Like if you expect them to be sharing their stories, you best be willing to step up and like share parts of yourself as well. Otherwise you're not creating any kind of safety or any kind of trust. And I think like also recognizing that Indigenous stories and concepts and worldviews and teachings are worthy of being taught even if there aren't Indigenous students in the room. It's not like some isolated event, like Stephanie was saying, like you don't just teach it during Thanksgiving time or like on around Indigenous Peoples Day or like during November, which is like Native American History Month. Like those are stories and teachings worth being recognized all of the time, just like every other story and every other experience. And like that will really like help, like if you have like students that are Indigenous that you don't even know are Indigenous in your classroom, that can help them like feel safe, like being themselves like in that space and like recognizing that their stories are worth being told in every space also. And I think like one final thing is just that like I think safety, like even in its most basic form, is like really important. Like we imagine like safe space being about like, you know, your emotional well-being and all that stuff, but also like your physical safety. You know, like like Stephanie said, like we're Indigenous youth are not only racialized, but we are also colonized. And so like recognizing that like with that identity comes a lot of like insecurity and unsafety in our like everyday realities. And so like recognizing that you're not just creating a space where like kids can be themselves and like dream their biggest dreams and stuff, but you're also creating a space where like you will not allow like all of the like turbulence from the world and like their everyday experiences to like come crashing down on them in that space that you are helping to cultivate for them. So I think it's not just about like all of the frilly parts of like creating safe space, but it's about like legit in this classroom, in this space, I am here to keep you safe. I am here to keep you well. I'm here to like support you in whatever way you need and like help you dream your biggest dreams and support you in achieving that. Yeah.
Thank
Safe
you.
spaces.
Thank you. So we've got about 3 minutes left. Oh yeah, so just so you know, I did, there is a handout that includes 2 articles that Dr. Gentry wrote, and it's got some references of sort of different Native American people in different professions, because one of the difficult parts is just even because there's so much invisibility of American Indian people, even just getting good information on is hard, even for me. And I mean, so it's ridiculous. So I tried to make you a list of that. I made you a list of just sort of random resources. One of them is also an article written by Stephanie, and then also 2 curriculum websites that she recommended. And my email is on there. So if you have other questions, my email is on that handout. If you wanted to get in touch, I didn't put anybody else's email on them there, but you can email me with questions. And if we have other questions here we haven't answered, I will make sure to email you answers. My personal email is just my name, ann.gray@nmt.edu, because I'm working at New Mexico Tech now.
Also posting a link to this website called nativelands.ca. So it's a project that some like First Nations and Indigenous scholars have been working on to create like a map of all the Indigenous territories. So they've like started with like Canada and America and like this continent and stuff. But so if you like want to know what Indigenous lands you're standing on, and also want to like get started on doing like land acknowledgements, like this is a great place to start. So yeah.
Okay, thank you guys so much. It was so nice. And I noticed, Marcia, that you talked about some of the identification things, and you know, our next breakout in this room is going to be on TAPAS, which is specifically gathering preponderance of appropriate evidence to identify underserved populations. So anybody who wants to attend that, that's going to be awesome too. Can I ask everybody but Anne to go ahead and hop off? Oh, I've got 2 new messages. Let me share. Just mostly thank yous. Everybody says thank you.
I did share the OCR site. So if anybody wants to go and look at their own school building or school district data, you can click that link, and then there's directions in the next box after that.
And
sort of a drill down from the access denied report, but to a local level.
Thank you so much, Marcia. And Jackie did talk about the process of self-determination and trying to articulate to make sure that we have funding and resources in New Mexico. And actually, NMAG is co-sponsoring a bill right now to try to make that happen. So if you want to look on the legislative website, I don't have it right off. We have a bill that we're trying to push through and process. So we agree with that. So I'm going to stop that for right now. And I hope everybody has a super great day and we get to see you again soon.
Thanks to my panelists and thank you all for participating.